It was quiet beneath the surface. Only the slow thrum of diesel engines, the hiss of pipes, and the drip of condensation filled the steel corridor. Inside the German U-boat U-20, a sailor cupped a steaming bowl of soup with both hands. The air was thick, warm, wet, heavy with the smell of oil and iron. Around him hung strings of sausages, cans swaying with each motion of the sea, and the dull shine of condensation that the crew called U-boat Schweiß, U-boat sweat. Few knew that life continued down here. 36 men sealed inside a tube of metal for weeks, fighting not only the enemy, but the sea itself. And even here, in the depths, they had to eat. The bowl he held was simple sauerkraut soup. Sour, thin, salty, but in that moment it was comfort, a brief warmth against the cold of the Atlantic above. In 1915, the same year the U-boat U-20 sent a torpedo into the Lusitania, its crew lived their days by the rhythm of the engines, measuring time and meals that grew worse with each passing day. When the war began in 1914, the German Imperial Navy had just 20 working submarines, Unterseeboote, literally boats under the sea. By the end of the conflict, more than 350 had been built, and they ruled the cold waters like iron wolves. Each U-boat was around 210 feet long, barely 20 feet across, and 27 feet high. It carried torpedoes at both ends, 2 tubes forward, 2 aft, 2 850-horsepower diesel engines for surface travel, and electric motors powered by massive batteries for when it slipped beneath the waves. But almost none of that space belonged to the men. There was the captain's narrow cabin, a wireless station, a control room filled with dials, and then the bunks, stacked 3 high, wedged between torpedoes and fuel tanks. And in one corner, barely large enough for a man to turn around, was the combuse, the kitchen. Before departure, the U-boat was stuffed with supplies: sausages, bacon, potatoes, peas, flour, butter, eggs, coffee, sugar, tea, and tins of meat and fruit. Everything had to fit somewhere, under bunks, behind panels, hanging from pipes, even in the bathroom. The most perishable goods, milk, vegetables, butter, were placed in the ammunition room, the only place that stayed a few degrees cooler. But once the sub left port, the ocean dictated what survived. Inside a U-boat, the air was always wrong. The temperature often climbed to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the humidity close to 100%. Moisture rolled down the walls like rain. Nothing ever dried. The metal sweated. The men sweated. Even their food sweated. Bread went moldy in days. Meat spoiled faster. Diesel fumes mixed with steam and settled on everything. Even the coffee wore a thin sheen of oil. They called it soup with fuel, half joking, but no one laughed for long. After 10 days at sea, the butter was rancid, the milk gone, and the eggs, if any remained, were precious treasures. Canned peas, salted fish, and black bread became the heart of every meal. From a 1915 wartime cookbook, Krieg's Kochbuch, came one of the few recipes simple enough to cook underwater: sauerkraut soup. Fat, flour, water, vinegar, salt, and a handful of sauerkraut, nothing more. The cook whisked the flour and butter into a thin roux, added the water, and stirred in the kraut until the smell filled the corridor. It wasn't elegant, but it was safe, and it lasted. One commander remembered later, "Food, that was always the great problem, that interminable diet of canned stuff, peas and bacon. I have never again been able to look a pea in the face." In those weeks, eating became an act of endurance. Necessity made inventors out of sailors. They learnt to boil water on the heat of the engines and warm bread on the casing of a diesel tank. They stretched butter by half, reused every scrap of fat, and mixed rum into tea when spirits ran low. Every so often, luck found them. At Christmas 1915, aboard the U-20, they decorated their crammed mess with a green reef. There were no candoms. A single spark could have ended them all. But they opened their tins, officers and crew together. In the dim light they ate tinned meat, canned fruit, and drank tea laced with rum. In that iron tomb, it almost felt like home. On another patrol, U-19 rose near the Orkney Islands. The men spotted goats grazing on a rocky shore. They went ashore with rifles and returned triumphant, dragging a fresh carcass through the surf. That night they feasted on roast goat, the smell of smoke and salt filling the sub. For a brief moment, war tasted like victory. And there were stranger fortunes still. After sinking merchant ships, U-boat crews were allowed to take supplies before sending the vessels down. They carried home sugar, ham, coffee, and butter, gifts for families starving under blockade. One captain rejoiced when they found a holdful of marmalade. "Enough to last 6 months. No, I shall never forget that ship," he wrote. Even in war of machines, food was still treasure. Within those submarines lived small dramas that never reached history books. There was the cook, Midtunk, aboard U-64, mocked for his thin soup, but beloved all the same. When criticism broke his spirit, his commander nominated him for the Iron Cross, not for heroism, but for carrying ammunition up the ladder during battle, just to remind him he mattered. Other memories surfaced years later. A German cook baking a small cake with canned fruit and cream for a rescued child from a sunken ship. A captured American sailor writing home that he'd eaten fresh rolls and butter aboard the enemy's boat. A monkey named Phipps on U-35, famous for stealing eggs when the cook's back was turned, and for eating more bananas than the crew after they sank a ship carrying fruit. Even a dachshund named Maria, who had her puppies aboard U-20. These fragments of life proved that humanity clung to the edges of the machine. While nations fought above, men below learned to survive with humor, discipline, and the thin comfort of warm food. When supplies ran out, they lived on black bread, dried peas, and memories of kitchens far away. But no matter how small the meal, it meant survival, a victory as real as any one on the surface. When the war ended, Germany's U-boats were surrendered and later broken apart, some dismantled in shipyards, others scuttled at sea. Their metal rusted back into the ocean, but their stories remained. Stories of men who learned that eating could be an act of courage. Those who survived never forgot the smell: oil, metal, vinegar, and salt. They never forgot the sound of dripping water or the taste of soup touched by smoke and fear. Under tons of water, a bowl of soup was a sign of life. And every bite reminded them that even in darkness, warmth could endure. Because beneath the waves of World War I, hunger had its own pressure, and they ate to survive.